Not every monster is born of malice. This time, my journey takes me to the ancient rivers of Japan, where a mischievous water spirit called the Kappa is blamed for a series of disappearances. But what if the truth behind the legend is not what we expect? What if the real monster isn't a monster at all? This time, the weapon might not be a gun, but understanding. The Wendigo incident in Canada had left its scars, both physical and mental. I'd spent the following few weeks in some port city on the west coast, trying to shake off the haunting images of the frigid taiga forest and the creature's savage howls. Long nights were still plagued by fragmented dreams of the agency, of experiments I couldn't clearly recall but whose horror I could feel. A deep-seated exhaustion seemed to have seeped into my very bones. Sometimes, I wondered how much longer I could keep this life up. A life of wandering, solitude, hunting things the world refused to acknowledge. One gloomy afternoon, while sitting in a rundown internet cafe, trying to find some semblance of normalcy amidst the chaos of my existence, a strange email landed in my junk folder. The subject line was in Japanese, but the content was translated into English, rather clumsily. It spoke of mysterious disappearances in a remote village called Mizukami, nestled deep in the mountainous region of Japan. The local villagers believed the culprit was a kappa, a type of water yokai from their folklore. Initially, I was skeptical. A kappa? A green-skinned creature with a turtle shell, a fondness for cucumbers, and a habit of dragging people underwater? It sounded more like a fairy tale than a genuine threat. This world was full of strange things, I knew that. But a Japanese folkloric demon? Perhaps it was just a hoax, or the misunderstanding of overly superstitious country folk. I'd faced mutated creatures, ancient entities, but a kappa, it seemed a little different. However, something in the email made me unable to dismiss it. The way the writer described the villagers' fear, the helplessness of local authorities, and the details of the disappearances. They had an unsettling ring of truth. And then, a flicker of curiosity. Japan. An entirely different culture, a world I'd never known. A new kind of monster. Unlike the ferocious beasts or vengeful spirits I'd encountered before, perhaps this was what I needed, a change. I was tired of just hunting and destroying, of bloody battles and tragic endings. Was there another approach? A chance to understand, instead of just annihilate? A longing for something different, for some deeper meaning in this dangerous work, began to stir within me. The decision was made more quickly than I anticipated. I would go to Japan. The following days were spent in preparation, not just the usual gear, handgun, knife, notebook, but also knowledge. I read everything I could find about kappa. The legends, their described characteristics, their rumored weaknesses. The water-filled dish on their heads, their obsession with cucumbers and sumo wrestling, their mischievous, yet sometimes dangerous nature. I also tried to learn a few basic Japanese phrases, though I knew it would be difficult. Japanese culture was complex and full of unspoken rules, and I didn't want to cause more trouble through my own ignorance. The journey east began. A long flight transported me to an entirely unfamiliar world, a world of ancient temples, modern cities, and peaceful countryside hiding its own secrets. I felt a mixture of apprehension and excitement. This wasn't just a new hunt. This could be a chance to find something lost, not just memories, but perhaps a part of myself. Manuhem mana tuel hotaya faita mana. Banuhem mana tuel hoshai. Mana tuel hoshais. Or maybe I was just deceiving myself. Time would tell. After a swaying train ride and a sputtering bus journey through winding mountain roads, I finally arrived in Mizukami. This small village was nestled in a lush green valley, surrounded by majestic mountains and a meandering, crystal-clear river. The air here was remarkably fresh, carrying the damp scent of earth after rain and the delicate fragrance of wildflowers. Traditional wooden houses with curved tile roofs stood close together, their small, meticulously cared-for gardens adding to a picture of tranquility, almost completely detached from the noisy world outside. It was perhaps the end of the rainy season. Occasional sudden downpours only enhanced the serene and somewhat mystical atmosphere. However, that peacefulness seemed to be only superficial. As a foreigner, tall and distinctly different in appearance, my arrival immediately attracted attention. Curious, wary, and even slightly fearful eyes followed my every step. Children playing in the street hastily ran indoors when they saw me approach. Adults bowed politely, but distantly, then quickly moved away. The familiar feeling of being an outsider once again enveloped me. Here, I wasn't just a stranger, I was a gaijin, an outlander. I tried to use my limited Japanese to ask for directions to the village headman's house, hoping he could provide more information. Communication was incredibly difficult. Some people shook their heads, not understanding. Others pointed vaguely. Their reticence was almost palpable. It felt as if an invisible wall separated me from the secrets of this village. Finally, a kind-faced elderly woman, perhaps noticing my bewilderment, slowly led me to a slightly larger house than the others, located at the end of the village near the riverbank. This was the home of Mr. Sato, the village headman. Mr. Sato was a man in his 50s, with a kind face that nonetheless held many worries. He received me in a traditional tatami-matted room, offering me tea. Initially, the conversation was quite tense. Mr. Sato seemed suspicious of my purpose, even though I tried my best to explain sincerely that I was here to understand and possibly help. When I mentioned the kappa, Mr. Sato's expression became more serious. A strange mixture of fear and something akin to reverence was evident on his face. He told me about the disappearances. 2 children had vanished while playing near the river a few months ago. More recently, a fisherman had also failed to return after a night of fishing. No trace of them had been found, except for a few oddities. There were footprints, Mr. Sato said slowly, his voice low. Webbed footprints, not like those of a human or an animal. And a strong, fishy smell around that area. Sometimes, the cucumbers we leave as offerings by the riverbank also disappear mysteriously. Cucumbers. That detail matched what I had read about kappa. During our conversation, another elderly man entered, perhaps a village elder knowledgeable in ancient legends. He looked at me with scrutinizing eyes, then began to tell stories about the kappa, about its power, its mischievous yet sometimes fearsome nature. He said the kappa was the guardian of the river but could also punish those who disrespected it. His narrative was steeped in a spiritual tone which intrigued me while also making me somewhat skeptical. Leaving the headman's house as dusk settled, my mind was heavy with thoughts. This village of Mizukami was not as simple as it appeared. A mystery shrouded this place, a mystery tied to the river and the legendary creature called kappa. And the people here, they weren't just afraid. They had a complex connection, an almost religious reverence for the very thing they believed was causing tragedies in their community. My mission here, perhaps, was not just to find the truth about the disappearances, but also to understand this strange relationship. The next day, I began my investigation along the banks of the river that snaked around Mizukami village. The current was quite strong in some sections, but there were also calm stretches, forming small pools and muddy flats. These were the areas the village headman, Sato, had pointed out to me, where the disappearances had occurred. The morning air was fresh, birds chirped merrily, but a strange stillness hung over the river, as if it were hiding a secret. My investigative skills were once again put to use. I carefully scanned every foot of ground, searching for any unusual signs. The webbed footprints Mr. Sato had mentioned were hard to find, perhaps washed away by rain or the current. However, in a few muddy patches near the water's edge, I found some strange indentations, indistinct in shape but definitely not made by humans or common animals. I took photos, noting them down carefully in my notebook. I also searched for potential hiding spots, riverside rock crevices, dense thickets, or small caves that might be obscured by water at high tide. As I walked along the riverbank, I began to feel a different kind of presence. It wasn't like the menacing, stalking feeling I'd had with the Wendigo. This sensation was more ambiguous, almost like a curiosity from the other side, from beneath the water. Perhaps it was just my imagination, influenced by the stories and the mystical atmosphere of this place. But I couldn't completely dismiss it. In the afternoon, I returned to the village, trying to talk more with some of the locals. The initial wariness was still there, but when they saw I was genuinely serious and had no ill intentions, a few became more open. I found my way to a small shrine tucked away behind a bamboo grove, where villagers occasionally came to pray. There, I met the shrine's caretaker, an old man with silver hair and kind yet profound eyes. The old man told me more about the kappa, about the water-filled dish on its head, its source of power, and also its fatal weakness. If that dish ran dry or was broken, the kappa would lose all its strength. He also spoke of the kappa's peculiar fondness for cucumbers and sumo wrestling, saying that if someone offered a kappa cucumbers or challenged it to sumo with respect, the kappa might not harm them and might even help. The old man's stories blended fact and myth, making me even more curious. "Kappa are not entirely evil, sir," the old man said, his voice slow. "They are a part of the river, a part of nature. Sometimes they are mischievous, sometimes they cause trouble, but they are also protectors of the water. Our villagers both fear them and revere them. We have small rituals, offering cucumbers, praying for peace for the river and for the village." The old man's words made me think. The relationship between humans and monsters here was truly complex. It wasn't simply predator and prey, not a clear-cut case of good versus evil. There was a strange symbiosis, an acceptance of the supernatural as a part of life. This was completely different from what I had experienced in the West, where monsters usually equated to destruction. On my way back to my lodgings, a small room the village headman had arranged for me, I happened upon a little girl sitting alone by the riverbank, holding a cucumber. She was about 7 or 8 years old, with large, dark, round eyes. Seeing me, she didn't show fear like the other children, but just looked curioso. I smiled, trying to appear friendly. "What are you doing here alone?" I asked in my broken Japanese. The little girl looked up, pointing towards the river. "I'm waiting for my friend." "Your friend?" She nodded, then hesitated before saying, "My friend, Kappa." I was surprised. A child speaking of the kappa as a friend? This was completely contrary to the fear I had sensed from the adults. Perhaps children had a different way of seeing the world, an innocence and openness that adults had lost. The brief encounter with the little girl left me with many thoughts. The mystery of the kappa seemed to lie not only in the disappearances, but also in its relationship with the people here, especially with pure souls like this child. Perhaps the key to solving this problem wasn't a gun, but understanding. That night, I decided to try my luck. Based on what the old shrine keeper and the little girl by the river had said, I chose a secluded stretch of the river where the water flowed gently and dense reeds grew thickly, an ideal hiding spot. This time, I didn't carry my gun openly, though it was still well hidden under my jacket. The fighting knife remained in its usual place. But my mindset was different. I wasn't here to destroy, at least not immediately. I wanted to observe, to understand. I placed a few fresh, delicious cucumbers, which I had asked the village headman to buy for me, on a flat rock near the water's edge. Then I retreated, concealing myself behind a large bush, and waited patiently. The night in rural Japan was incredibly still, filled only with the chirping of insects and the gentle lapping of water. The faint light of a crescent moon wasn't enough to dispel the darkness, but it created a somewhat ethereal scene. Hours passed. My patience began to wear thin. Perhaps this was just a foolish idea, a waste of time. Maybe the kappa was just a legend, and the disappearances had a completely different, more mundane explanation. But the image of the little girl with her cucumber and her innocent belief in her kappa friend kept haunting me, keeping me there. I hoped, faintly, that this time things would be different. Then, Just as I was starting to feel disheartened, the water surface rippled softly, not from the wind, but from a movement beneath. I held my breath, focusing all my attention. Oi! From under the dark water, a head slowly emerged. Its skin was a pale, glossy green. On top of its head was a concave dish filled with water that sparkled under the moonlight. Large, round, amber-colored eyes scanned its surroundings cautiously. Then, it saw the cucumbers. Kappa? It wasn't hideous like some of the more gruesome descriptions I'd read. Its body was small, perhaps only as tall as a child, with a small turtle shell on its back. Its fingers and toes were webbed, but they didn't look sharp or dangerous. Its face had a somewhat comical, almost childlike appearance, with a beak-like mouth. If it weren't for the stories of it dragging people underwater, I might have found it cute, or at least not frightening. It cautiously crawled ashore, its eyes still constantly scanning its surroundings. When it neared the cucumbers, it sniffed, then quickly snatched one, munching on it en masse with relish. The sound of its chewing echoed in the still night. I decided it was time to act. I slowly stood up, trying not to make any sudden movements. Instantly, the kappa startled. It dropped the half-eaten cucumber, took a step back, its body tensing, its wide eyes fixed on me with alarm. It emitted small, hissing sounds, like a warning. "Hello," I said softly, trying to keep my voice gentle, and raised my hands, palms open to show I was unarmed. "I mean you no harm." I spoke in English, then tried to repeat it in the few simple Japanese phrases I'd learned. The kappa tilted its head, staring at me. The tension was evident in its posture. I stood still, not daring to move. I knew one wrong move could make it panic and flee. Or worse, attack. After a long moment, seeming to realize I had no intention of attacking, the kappa slowly relaxed a little. It stopped hissing, but its eyes never left me. Then, it did something unexpected. It bent down, picked up the piece of cucumber again, and then held it out towards me, as if offering to share. I was stunned. This was not the action of a ferocious monster. I slowly approached, still maintaining a safe distance. I shook my head gently, smiling. "Thank you. You can have it." The kappa looked at me, then at the cucumber, appearing slightly confused. Then, it resumed eating, but it occasionally glanced up at me, its large, round eyes shining with an indescribable curiosity. It didn't seem malicious at all. On the contrary, there was something almost innocent, lonely, in its gaze. We stood like that for a long time, in a silence broken only by the kappa's munching and my own breathing. There was no threat, no hostility. Just a mythical creature and a monster hunter trying to understand each other in their own unique way. This surprise was far beyond anything I could have imagined. This yokai was unlike anything I had ever faced. And perhaps my mission here would also be unlike any mission before. The following nights, I returned to the same spot by the river, always bringing a small offering of cucumbers. And each night, the kappa appeared. My initial surprise and skepticism slowly began to fade, replaced by a cautious acceptance and a genuine desire to understand this creature. It was a slow process, built on patience and an unspoken agreement not to threaten one another. The kappa, whom I'd started to mentally refer to simply as Kawa River, for lack of a better name, gradually became less wary of my presence. It would still approach the cucumbers cautiously, but it no longer flinched every time I made a slight movement. We'd often sit in comfortable silence for long stretches, Kawa munching on its treat, me observing, trying to decipher its subtle gestures and expressions. I began to notice things. The way its large, amber eyes would follow a firefly as it danced everywhere in the night air, a childlike wonder in its gaze. The soft gurgling sounds it made when it seemed content. The way it would sometimes dip its head, ensuring the water in the dish on its crown remained full. A gesture, almost, of self-preservation, yet done with a strange sort of grace. It became increasingly clear that Kawa wasn't malicious. The stories of it dragging people underwater to drown them felt wrong, juxtaposed with the creature I was getting to know. I started to suspect the disappearances might be more complex. Perhaps accidental drownings in the strong currents, or a KAPPA'S idea of a prank gone wrong, a tug on a leg, a playful pull, not intended to cause serious harm but terrifying to a human. Or maybe Kawa wasn't the only kappa in this river, and others were less benign. But the one before me, it exuded a profound sense of loneliness. It was a solitary creature, separate from the human world, and seemingly from any of its own kind I could discern. There was a melancholy in its quietude, a sense of being an outsider, and in that I found an unexpected, almost uncomfortable resonance. My own life, stripped of memory and connection, was a testament to a similar kind of isolation. I, too, was an outsider, navigating a world I didn't fully belong to, haunted by a past I couldn't grasp. This shared sense of solitude, however different our circumstances, forged a strange, silent bond between us. One night, I brought my Zippo lighter. Not to use it as a weapon, but out of habit, and, perhaps, a test. I flicked it open, the small flame dancing in the darkness. Kawa tilted its head, its eyes fixated on the light, not with fear like the Wendigo, but with an intense curiosity. It slowly reached out a webbed hand, as if wanting to touch the flame, then quickly retracted it, making a soft, chattering sound. Another time, I was sketching in my notebook, an old habit, trying to document these creatures. Kawa crept closer, peering over my shoulder at the drawings. It seemed particularly fascinated by a crude sketch I'd made of itself. It even nudged the notebook with its snout, as if in approval, or perhaps just curiosity about the marks on the paper. It started to mimic small actions of mine. If I stretched, it would awkwardly try to stretch its own limbs. If I skipped a stone across the water, it would watch intently, then try to push a pebble with its webbed foot, with comical results. These small interactions, these silent conversations, were building a fragile bridge of trust. I wasn't sure if friendship was the right word for what was forming between a human monster tracker and a folkloric water spirit, but there was undeniably a connection. Kawa was no longer just a target, a case file. It was a being, complex and misunderstood. The thought of ever having to harm it now felt abhorrent. My mission parameters were shifting, whether I consciously willed it or not. I wasn't just here to solve the mystery of the disappearances anymore. I was beginning to feel a responsibility towards this lonely creature of the river. And that, I knew, could lead to a whole new set of complications. The quiet nights by the river with Kawa had become a strange sort of routine, a brief respite from the usual tension of my life. But I knew, deep down, that such peace was often fleeting. The world I operated in rarely allowed for simple, uncomplicated coexistences, especially when it involved creatures deemed monsters. My growing protectiveness towards Kawa was a new, unsettling feeling. It was one thing to analyze a creature, to understand its behavior, but to feel a genuine responsibility for its well-being? That was treading into dangerous territory for someone like me. It created an internal conflict. How could I reconcile this with my past, with the ingrained instincts of a hunter, with the very nature of what the agency might have molded me into? And more pressingly, how could I protect Kawa if the villagers, or someone else, decided it was a threat that needed to be eliminated? The thought of explaining Kawa's true nature, its loneliness, its apparent lack of malice, to people gripped by fear or driven by other motives seemed almost impossible. My unease proved to be well-founded. One afternoon, while I was subtly observing the river from a distance, trying to map Kawa's usual patterns without disturbing it, I noticed a new presence in Mizukami, a small group of men, 3 of them, clearly not locals. They were dressed functionally, in outdoor gear that looked a little too professional for casual tourists, and they carried themselves with an air of purpose that immediately set my internal alarms ringing. They were asking questions around the village, and though I couldn't hear their conversations, their focused interest in the river area was unmistakable. I decided to keep a low profile and observe them. They weren't as discreet as they thought. Later that day, I overheard snippets of their conversation near the small village shop, a mix of heavily accented English and what sounded like a Slavic language. They spoke of specimen, capture, and unique biological properties. My blood ran cold. These weren't concerned locals or superstitious villagers. These were professionals, and their interest in Kawa was clinical, predatory. They reminded me, chillingly, of how the agency might operate. That evening I tailed them as they headed towards the river, just as dusk was settling. They weren't going to Kawa's usual spot, but to a narrower, more secluded part of the river, upstream. They were carrying equipment I recognized with a sinking feeling: nets, tranquilizer guns, and a device that looked like a high-powered water pump. It didn't take a genius to figure out their plan. They knew about the KAPPA'S dish, the source of its power. They were likely planning to either forcibly empty it or trap Kawa when it was vulnerable. Pull. A surge of anger, cold and sharp, cut through me. These men weren't interested in understanding or coexisting. They saw Kawa as nothing more than a prize, a thing to be captured and exploited. The same way the agency probably viewed countless other beings, perhaps even me at one point. My internal conflict vanished, replaced by a singular, clear purpose. I had to stop them. I had to protect Kawa. The irony wasn't lost on me. Ryder, the monster tracker, now found himself in the position of protecting a monster from other humans. But as I watched these men prepare their trap, their faces grim and determined in the fading light, I knew who the real monsters were in this scenario. My hand instinctively went to the familiar weight of my holstered pistol, then to the kabar knife at my boot. This time, however, my first thought wasn't about killing. It was about outsmarting them, about ensuring Kawa's safety without necessarily resorting to lethal force against these men, unless I had no other choice. The game had changed. And so, it seemed, had I. Darkness had fully settled over the riverbank, the only light coming from the sliver of a moon and the dim tactical flashlights the three men were using. They were working efficiently, setting up their nets across a narrow channel and positioning the water pump nearby, clearly intending to flush Kawa out or disable it. My jaw tightened. There was no time for hesitation, was it? My resolve to protect Kawa was absolute. If it meant confronting these men, even using force, then so be it. This was a stark departure from my previous encounters. Before, my primary objective was often elimination or containment of a threat. Now, I was a guardian, a protector. The lines had indeed blurred, and I found myself wondering again who the real monsters were. These men, with their cold calculations and intent to exploit a unique creature, seemed far more monstrous than the lonely Kappa I'd come to know. Stealth was my first ally. I moved through the dense undergrowth like a wraith, my years of experience, or perhaps ingrained training from a forgotten past, serving me well. They were focused on their setup, their backs mostly to the deeper woods where I approached. Strayets. My plan wasn't to engage them in a direct firefight if I could avoid it. That would be too noisy, too risky, and could inadvertently harm Kawa. Instead, I aimed for disruption, for sabotage. I spotted their main power source for the pump, a portable generator humming quietly nearby. That was my first target. Under the cover of a rustling breeze, I managed to get close enough to disable it. A quick, precise cut to a crucial wire. The hum died abruptly. "What the hell?" one of them muttered, his voice carrying in the still air. "Check the generator, Ivan." As Ivan moved away from the group, grumbling, I saw my next opportunity. The man closest to the nets was fiddling with a control box, likely for a trigger mechanism. A well-aimed rock, thrown with force from the shadows, struck his hand. He yelped, dropping the box. "We've got company!" Another one shouted, his voice sharp with alarm as he unslung a tranquilizer rifle. So much for a completely silent approach. The next few minutes were a blur of calculated chaos. I didn't charge in, guns blazing. Instead, I used the terrain to my advantage, a shadow darting between trees, creating distractions and disorienting them. I didn't want to kill them, but I wouldn't hesitate to incapacitate them if necessary. A quick takedown on Ivan as he fumbled with the generator, a non-lethal pressure point strike that sent him slumping to the ground. The leader, a burly man with a harsh face, was more a thing. He fired a tranquilizer dart that whizzed past my ear. I returned fire with my own pistol, but aimed low at his legs, forcing him to take cover. This wasn't about marksmanship, it was about control. Suddenly, there was a splash from the river. Kawa, it must have sensed the commotion. Instead of fleeing, it surfaced near the bank, its large eyes wide with what looked like a mixture of fear and confusion. The leader saw it too. "There it is! Get the net!" He lunged towards Kawa, but before he could reach it, something unexpected happened. Kawa, perhaps sensing the immediate threat, or maybe even recognizing me amidst the chaos, let out a series of sharp, barking yelps. Then, with surprising agility, it slapped its webbed hand hard against the water surface. A large plume of water erupted, drenching the leader and momentarily blinding him. It wasn't an attack, more like a desperate, instinctual act of defense, or even a distraction, but it gave me the opening I needed. I closed the distance quickly, disarming the leader with a swift move I barely remembered learning. A short, brutal scuffle ensued, ending with him on the ground, groaning, my kabar pressed lightly against his throat. "This hunt is over," I said, my voice low and cold. "Leave, and don't come back for the kappa." The third man, seeing his companions neutralized, and likely unnerved by Kawa's sudden appearance and actions, wisely decided to raise his hands. The immediate threat had passed. Kawa, still in the water, looked from the subdued men to me. Its head tilted. There was no way to know what it was thinking, but for a moment I felt a strange sense of an alliance, an unspoken understanding between two very different beings who had, in their own ways, protected each other. With the three would-be Kappa hunters subdued and their equipment disabled, a tense quiet settled over the riverbank once more. I made sure they understood the severity of their mistake and the consequences if they ever returned to Mizukami with similar intentions. After relieving them of any remaining dangerous gear and ensuring they were capable of leaving on their own, albeit with bruised egos and bodies, I watched them retreat into the darkness, their muttered curses fading with them. The immediate danger had passed, at least for now. Kawa remained in the water, its large amber eyes fixed on me. The fear and confusion seemed to have subsided, replaced by that familiar, intense curiosity. I walked to the river's edge, a sense of relief washing over me, mingled with a distinct sadness. My time here was coming to an end. "You're safe now," I said softly, more to myself than to the kappa. There was no way to truly communicate the complexities of the situation, but I hoped some understanding passed between us in that shared moment of stillness. Kawa made a soft gurgling sound, almost like a response. It dipped its head, the water in its dish rippling, then slowly submerged, disappearing beneath the dark surface without a trace. It wasn't a frightened retreat, more like a quiet acknowledgement, a return to its own world. The next morning, I spoke with Mr. Sato, the village headman, and the old shrine keeper. I didn't reveal the full extent of my encounter with the hunters, nor did I explicitly confirm Kawa's sentience or my interactions with it. These were truths the village, with its delicate balance of fear and reverence, might not be ready for, and could even inadvertently endanger Kawa further. Instead, I chose my words carefully. I spoke of the natural balance of the river, of how sometimes unexplained events occur, and how an outside, aggressive force had been dealt with and was unlikely to return. I subtly suggested that perhaps the spirit of the river, their kappa, was more of a misunderstood guardian than a malevolent entity, and that respecting its territory and continuing their offerings of cucumbers might be the best way to ensure peace. I hope to plant a seed of a new legend, one that emphasized coexistence rather than just fear, a narrative that might offer Kawa a little more protection in my absence. The old shrine keeper listened intently, a knowing look in his ancient eyes. Mr. Sato seemed relieved that the immediate threat of further investigators was gone, and perhaps a little more open to the idea that the kappa wasn't purely a source of dread. Whether my words would truly change anything in the long run, I couldn't say. But I had to try. Leaving Mizukami felt different from my other departures. There was a pang of regret, a sense of leaving something unfinished, or perhaps something unexpectedly found. This journey hadn't been about a brutal fight or a terrifying monster in the traditional sense. It had been about discovery, about challenging my own preconceptions, and about an unlikely connection with a creature most would deem an abomination. The world of monsters was far more nuanced than I had ever imagined. Not all were driven by mindless hunger or inherent evil. Some, like Kawa, were simply beings trying to exist, misunderstood, and often persecuted. This realization was a profound lesson, one that chipped away a little more at the cynical shell I'd built around myself. It also made me wonder about the agency again. If they knew about creatures like Kawa, what were their plans for them? Were all assets destined for a lab, or a cage, or worse? As I journeyed away from the peaceful valley, carrying the memory of a lonely kappa and the quiet wisdom of an ancient village, I knew this experience had changed me. The monster tracker was still a hunter, still searching for his lost past, but perhaps he was also becoming something more. A student of the unknown, a reluctant protector, and maybe, just maybe, a little more human. The road ahead was still uncertain, filled with shadows and unanswered questions. But now, there was also a glimmer of something else, a new perspective, and a quiet promise I'd made by a Japanese river, to a friend I could never truly speak to.